Hey everybody, here we are back here on Bay Area Babylon, and today I'm excited to welcome back a good buddy of mine, one of the main authors here in the Santa Cruz area. He's got a fantastic book called Murder Capital of the World. The Santa Cruz community looks back at the Frazier, Mullen, and Kemper murder sprees of the early 1970s. It's a pleasure to welcome back Emerson Murray.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us here back here on Bay Area Babylon. And today we are going to be talking about none other than Ed Kemper and his victims here in Santa Cruz.
When did you stop hitchhiking?
Well, about a week ago. No, about last Monday, because that's when the reports came out that the girls were missing.
Yeah, we used to hitchhike, but now it's not real safe to do it, so we don't.
Why did you quit?
Because of all the weird things that have been happening with the rapes and girls being chopped up and things like that.
So Ed Kemper had been in a Atascadero mental hospital for the murder of his grandparents, and they had threatened to move him out to, I think it was Montana, because that's where his mother was from. He was underage. And supposedly that hospital, I think the name is mentioned in the book, was just notorious for being just a nightmare. So she moved out to California and she moved to Aptos. I think she lived somewhere else before that, but eventually ended up in Aptos, working at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And when he was released, you know, it was in Atascadero said he was, part of his problem is his mother. He should not be released to the custody of his mother. He really shouldn't see his mother ever. After he went to Atascadero, he spent a short time in the CYA, California Youth Authority. And when they released him, the terms of the release were he would be under the custody of his mother. So wires were crossed, messages were unheard or whatever. They just weren't listened to. And he was released to his mom in Aptos. And he said that his time in Atascadero, he was spent with these, essentially what he said, this isn't a direct quote, but with these rapists that had gotten caught. And he was young and he sort of figured, well, if the victims weren't alive, maybe they wouldn't have gotten caught. So, you know, here's this 15-year-old kid around all these violent criminals. Adult criminals, yeah, right.
To be there, yes.
Yeah, in Atascadero.
It started coming to a head again, so I went back down. I ran away back down there. And then a month later, I'm up living with my grandparents in the mountains, and 10 months later, I murdered them. And it made it worse to be on top of a mountain. I was literally on top of a mountain when it happened. And I sensed everybody in the world just stopping what they were doing, turning around, saw what I did, and are coming to get me. And I knew I was paranoid at that moment. I knew anybody that came up there and gave me a funny look or a fishy eye or quizzical look, I'd have blown their brains out thinking they were coming to get me. And if it had been in a city, I would have been a mass murderer at age 15.
This is one thing that a lot of people don't know, is that when he was in Atascadero, every once in a while he would get leave. So he came to Santa Cruz before he was officially released several times. He had been around. So it wasn't like this guy that just comes out of nowhere. So the idea of him being away at school, not utterly ridiculous. It's weird because supposedly, according to him, when he got out on some of those breaks, he did have sex with his mother's friends. There was like 2 women that he had sex with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when he was home on the weekend or something. So there's just so many contradictions in the stories. And as we mentioned earlier, Kemper just seems to tell stories based on the environment and what he needs from the story, you know.
The grisly story began in this cove. The upper part of a girl's torso washed up on this beach 2 miles north of the Santa Cruz Pier. There was almost no way to come up with an immediate identification. Then a hand was found 2 days later by a surfer who was in the water near Capitola, 7 miles to the southeast. The third find came on Monday of this week, immediately north of the Santa Cruz Pier. It was the lower part of the girl's torso, and at this point the pieces started to be built into a positive identification. 19-year-old Cynthia Ann Shaw. Santa Cruz sees a lot of hitchhikers, and Miss Shaw was last seen as she left her Santa Cruz home saying she intended to hitchhike to classes at Cabrillo College. 7 weeks ago, still another Cabrillo College co-ed disappeared while hitching to class. But there is no clue to her whereabouts.
The house behind me here at 609 Ord Street, or 609 Harriet Street, as it's found on Google Maps, Well, this is the home of Clarnell Strandberg, who met a terrible fate at the hands of a person who just happened to be your own son. As I mentioned in a previous Bay Area Babylon episode about Ed Kemper, he was stationed, well, more sentenced, to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security hospital for the mentally ill, after he murdered both his grandparents in cold blood. He was then released on his 21st birthday back in 1969, much to the disapproval of the hospital's team of physicians. They pleaded that moving back under his mother's roof would be a very bad move, and as the story played out, they were exactly right. Not having a job or any funding of his own, Big Ed's pockets were tight, to say the least, and he couldn't afford his own apartment. So what's a guy to do but move in with dear old mom back in her place? Hoping for the best and always getting anything but, Ed Kemper quickly learned that nothing had really changed in the past 5 years since he'd been sent away to the hospital. If anything, Clarnell now saw her son as an even bigger failure than what she did before. And in no time at all, the violent and vicious battles between Ed and his mother started back up again like clockwork. Oftentimes these arguments were overheard by Kemper's neighbors here in the surrounding neighborhood, but nobody could have even guessed the situation would turn deadly.
I need to be able to really communicate, and ironically enough, that's why I began picking people up. And I'm picking up young women, and I'm going a little bit farther each time. It's a daring kind of a thing. At first there wasn't a gun. I'm driving along. We go to a vulnerable place where there aren't people watching, where I could act out, and I say, no, I can't. And then a gun is in the car, hidden. And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. This fantastic passion. It was overwhelming me. It was like drugs. It was like alcohol. A little isn't enough. At first it is. And as you adjust to that, psychologically and physically, you take more and more and more. It's the same process. So it finally came down to the thing of, do I dare bring this gun out? Already realizing if that gun comes out, something has to happen.
He was fighting. They were both drinking a lot, and the fights would occur when they were both drunk, generally. His mom, by the accounts that I studied and read and interviewed, was tough, was mean, had a sarcastic, not sense of humor, but she was just sarcastic, very pointed, could be cruel in her words. But even read an interview with his sister. I did talk to one of their family friends, and the police talked to several of their family friends, and I read those interviews. By all accounts, she was tough. She was, and I interviewed one of her coworkers. She was tough, and she could be mean, you know, sometimes in a funny way, sometimes not so funny. And I think he had said something about, what could she have to teach me? You know, I grew up in there without her, and I came out as a man and all of this stuff. But kinda not, you know. He killed the family cats, 2 of them. She would wake up in the middle of the night with him standing over there with a hammer. He was sneaking out with a bayonet, and he's like 8 years old, 11 years old, you know, the different times, obviously. And so there's this tendency to want to simplify the situation, to say, oh, she's just evil, and she put him in this bedroom in the basement, and his story about that. And what do you do with a kid that you wake up in the middle of the night and he's standing over you with a hammer? I just idolized his dad, and the dad, let's be honest here, that didn't want anything to do with him. He left, and the sisters got it. In the interviews that I had read with his sisters, they understood that dad, he's out of the picture. He doesn't want to be with us. He made his choice. Ed Kemper never, I don't want to say never, but I sure felt like through most of his life didn't get that. He didn't understand that. His dad even came to him, I think, when he was in Atascadero and said, just pretend that I died in the war.
Oh my God. Wow.
So, and then even when he did, you know, when he did go to his dad's and stayed with his dad, it was a big trick. The dad brought him over to his parents, North Fork, California, and that's when he went and lived with his grandparents. It was a trick, you know. It's just rough. It's just rough.
So hoping that he would one day get away from his sharp-tongued mother, Ed got a job at the State of California Division of Highways, aka the Department of Transportation. It took just a few months, but eventually Ed was able to get up on his feet and rent an apartment about 70 miles north of here in the little town of Alameda, just outside of Oakland. But even still, even after putting such distance between himself and his mother, Edmund couldn't quite escape the grasp that Clarnell held over his psyche. It's not like the frequent calls berating him or the surprise visits from Clarnell weren't bad enough. But as Ed still struggled to support himself financially, he had to, periodically move back into dear old mom's house right here in Aptos. And every time that Ed would have to move back here home with dear old mom, Clarnell would make sure that Ed knew just how worthless he was. A pathetic example of a man that no girl would ever want to date, especially not one of those pretty college girls up at UCSC where she worked. You see, Clarnell knew that Ed never got to experience his teenage years like a regular kid, and that had a profound impact on Ed's confidence and his self-worth. But instead of trying to help her son get adjusted to life, outside the mental hospital walls, who knows, maybe even help find him a date or a friend, instead, Clarnell frequently referenced the young college girls where she worked at and just how self-respecting young women with bright futures would never date a lowlife like her son.
Ed Kemper was detained in a mental hospital from the age of 21 for the murder of his grandparents, but was later released on the advice of psychiatrists. Within 2 years, he had decapitated and mutilated 6 students as well as his mother and her best friend. He sometimes raped the corpses. In 1973, he gave himself up, since when Ed Kemper has been detained in a reform hospital in California.
And I think when he got here, he tried to fit in. He got a job, he was working, got a motorcycle, and to the point where he actually did get engaged. He was engaged to be married to a young lady. So I think he did his best. I know that he had told stories of where he had tortured cats and dogs. He had killed animals as an adult after he had been released. And when he was working at the gas station, there's a story in the book of him killing a cat that had wandered into the gas station. So the rage was there.
So before long, this burning rage that Kemper had towards his mom, began to curdle into this internal rage over these young women and, even on a grander scale, the city of Santa Cruz, and going further, society as a whole. He began to hate everything. But let me tell you, it all started out innocently enough. Ed knew that the more time he spent under Clarnell's roof here at 609 Ord Street, the more chances he would have of going berserk and losing it altogether. So in order to help calm himself, Ed started going out on these long drives throughout Aptos and Santa Cruz and the surrounding area, just out cruising, tooling around in his 1969 Ford Galaxy. And let me tell you, while driving around, he came across many hitchhikers, young female hitchhikers. So maybe in a way to prove his mother was wrong and that women didn't actually loathe the sight of him, Ed started to give these girls rides. At first, the young guy, wanted to, quote, get acquainted with people his own age and try to strike up a friendship. End quote. But in time, after picking up over 100 hitchhikers, according to Kemper himself, he could no longer control the bloodthirsty beast living inside of him. The beast needed to be fed. And that's when Ed Kemper began to hunt to kill.
It's interesting because I called it rage, but maybe it was a calculated. And that was him picking up all the hitchhikers and practicing and getting his clothes. What clothes? He had his killing suit or whatever he called it, where they were dark clothes, they wouldn't show the blood, and car of how he could put a chapstick or like a little thing into the door so victims couldn't get out. He would practice how he would act, and even the glasses that he wore to seem less dangerous or less memorable. And they would say, oh, I'm going to so-and-so, and he'd look at his watch as like a little play to be like, oh, I'm not sure if I have the time. It's so calculated that I know I use the word rage, but that may be the wrong word. He just slowly advanced in almost a systematic way to killing and just picking up hundreds, by his own account, hundreds of hitchhikers and giving them rides to where they needed to go. So when I talked to Chris Caudle, who was the assistant district attorney of Peter Chang, one of them, and then later became district attorney and later became a judge himself, he said it was a nightmare at that time to convince juries that just how horrible it was, that it was a crime, both men and women on juries. At that time, the dominating thought was, if you get picked up as a hitchhiker, all bets are off. What happens to you happens to you. But Chris Caudle told me he had a very tough time prosecuting anyone for any crime that happened when somebody was picked up for hitchhiking, because it was just this dominating thought that, oh, you get what you deserve. You got in the car with them.
You made that choice and
yeah,
rolled the
and
dice.
it's so backwards to how we think nowadays. I would even ask the police officers and law enforcement, the deputies, and they told stories about hitchhiking. Oh, we used to race to Santa Cruz. It's a rural environment here, so there's no bus system at that time. When you got to think about the gender norms, women oftentimes didn't drive. Boys would get their license and get cars, and it was just happening that women were starting to drive more and more. So it was just, hitchhiking was the way to get around, and it was just so normalized. And it wasn't until this stuff happened around here that really, by the time, like you said, in the 80s when I grew up, in the late 70s, there's no way, like, the boogeyman is real.
Right.
We have a real direct boogeyman. You will not be hitchhiking. You know people that were hurt or damaged or whatever, or killed.
Started killing people. I used that against them. But initially it was just a hobby, it was a habit, it was trying to fill in the blanks of 5.5 years of not being in society. I missed that flower child generation. I missed the entry into Vietnam, all that stuff. And all these kids are like aliens to me. Yeah, I say kids. I missed 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I'm supposed to be associating with people in their adult years. But I missed a big chunk, so I'm out there trying to fill in the gaps.
Now, on May 7th, 1972, Ed Kemper pulled over 2 female students from Fresno State University. The 2 18-year-old girls, Marianne Pache and Anita Lucchesa, needed a ride to get all the way over to Palo Alto. And yeah, Big Ed just happened to be going that way, and he wouldn't mind giving them a ride.
They were Fresno State students that were out on the road. They were friends. They were roommates. They met each other as roommates. They hadn't been friends very long. I think they had just started school. They had gone and visited somebody in Berkeley, and I think they were on their way to Stanford University when Kemper picked them up. Marianne Pesce had a lot of experience hitchhiking. According to her father's testimony at the trial, they had lived in Germany. She had traveled all over Europe. So she was used to traveling from her youth. The one thing you need to remember about these victims is they all died very young, so they don't have these extensive life stories. To me, makes it even more tragic and poignant. Like, you just have to remember that. And Pesce had been this world or had lived in Germany, traveled all around Europe. She was a skier, just active in her school. So Anita Lucchesa, she went to Fresno State, roommates. Her family from Modesto, and I don't know if it was a farm at the time, but that was sort of farm country around San Jose. Was mostly farm country at that time. But I don't know a lot about her early years, but she is the one that was very active in her school. She was like a yell leader and things like that. So she started to go to Fresno State. She was not an experienced hitchhiker, all accounts. That was new to her, and she was reticent to get into the car with Kemper and do that. But fortunately, she did. So
He picked up on that.
yeah, he did. He picked up on that, and then they drove, correct me if I'm wrong, it was out Highway 680?
680.
Yeah,
Towards
and
Livermore.
yeah, that's right. And then turned off on a road, got her, pulled out his gun, locked her in the trunk of the car, and then kills him. So.
He drove the bodies back to his apartment, and there he used them to satisfy his twisted sexual urges. The young man then proceeded to dismember the corpses and violate their severed heads before dumping their parts in nearby Loma Prieta Mountain, just a short drive over the hill from here. To make things even worse, more upsetting, Ed was actually stopped by the police as he was driving home that night. But because the officer only wanted to point out a broken taillight, he didn't check the trunk of the car, and therefore didn't see the bloody evidence that lay inside of it. Maybe if he had done so, the officer would have discovered the dead bodies of Anita and Marianne, and perhaps been able to put a stop to Ed's deadly crimes right then and there. But let me tell you, that didn't happen, and Kemper was set free to go on his way and continue to murder again. Now, 4 months later, up outside of Berkeley, a hitchhiking 15-year-old girl named Aiko Ku, who was innocently just trying to catch the crosstown bus to get to her dance class. Well, she made the horrible mistake, the unfortunate decision, to get into Ed Kemper's car when he offered her a ride. And before Aiko even knew it, Kemper had her trapped inside with no way to escape.
So Aiko Ku was from Berkeley. Her mother worked at UC Berkeley. Her mother was Latvian, I think, and Aiko did not know her father. Her father was Korean. My understanding was he was a professor at UC Berkeley. but she was raised by her mother and by her mother's parents, her grandparents who lived with them in Berkeley. And the mother was interesting because she knew that Aiko had been interested in Korean history, and so she really pushed that. And Aiko got into dancing. Again, a very short life. She only lived till she was 15, but she got into a form of traditional Korean dancing and traveled with a troupe all up and down the state of California. They may have gone outside of California. I know they had plans to before she died. And the family, the grandparents and the mother would sew these traditional costumes. So these elderly Latvian people sewing these beautiful Korean dance costumes for her. So I always thought that was sort of fascinating. And the mother, she was an author actually. I think she did a children's book, was pushing this culture that she wasn't her own culture. I thought that was sort of fascinating.
That is very sweet.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is. It's very sweet. So she went to a private high school, and she was actually taking, I believe, dance classes in San Francisco. And that day she was late to the dance classes. So she stuck out her thumb to hitchhike, and she had some experience in hitchhiking. She had actually gotten a ticket from the police for hitchhiking before, and her mom found out about it, and she promised her mom she wouldn't do that again. And
She called it a parking ticket, right?
yeah, it was like their little family joke.
it was a parking ticket,
Aiko's parking ticket. Yeah. Okay, so Aiko gets in the car with Kemper and very quickly realizes they're not going to San Francisco, and he manipulates the situation. Oh no, I know another turnoff, and pretty soon they're past all the turnoffs, going down Highway 1, down the coast road by Devil's Slide and all of that, and into Santa Cruz County, where then they turned out to Bonnie Doon Road.
Okay, so they were up by Davenport,
Yeah.
about 10 miles north of Santa Cruz.
Yep.
Go up into the hills up there.
Up into Bonnie Doon, yeah, and in the book it says exactly where, and that was from his transcript after he was caught, his first interview. I always felt like his first interview after he was caught was probably the most accurate, if you want, probably the closer to the truth that you're going to get. He just had there was no reason to lie in any of that. There's really no reason for him to talk, but he spilled his guts, after 3 days of no sleep on the road, popping no-dos. They interviewed him right away, and I always felt like that interview was probably the most accurate.
So once he gets up into Bonnie Doon up by Smith Grade Road, he stops the car. She knows that she's certainly in danger at this point. And am I correct? Is this the time when he locks himself out of the car?
Yeah. So it's interesting because the story gets very snappy and clever, but I believe, and if you read the book, it has exactly what happened. He says exactly what happened. And he did change that story as well, too, to make it cuter and more tragic at the same time. He got outside the car. The gun is in the front. He did have his keys in his pocket. But he asked her to unlock the door, and she did.
Guns under the seat. It's all just, whoa. I get up on the freeway, 2 turnoffs, Mills College. In fact, the next one said Mills College, next exit, But they're not relaxing or nothing. I had refused to take them the way they wanted to go and pushed it the other way. That's what scared them. But they didn't know the irony of it was if I'd have gone along their way, I'd have probably said, yeah, well, I'll just follow on through and oops, we'll do it one more time. How do you oops human lives? I don't know those 2 young ladies, and I don't know where they are today, and I don't know that they remember that little incident. But when I drove them to Mills College, inside of Mills College, to their college entrance, right to the building, to the dormitory, and they got out of that car and flew up those stairs. Never even looked back. I'll bet they quit hitchhiking quite so casually after that. But you know what? I don't think they know to this day.
And then about 4 months after scattering Aiko's dismembered body parts around different locations throughout Santa Cruz County, Ed Kemper enrolled in a local community college, Cabrillo College to be precise. It's a good school and located only about 5 minutes right here from the Ord murder house. Very convenient for Ed Kemper. Then on January 7, 1973, Ed killed a fellow student named Cindy Schall. The next victim on Ed Kemper's list was a young lady by the name of Cynthia Schall that he picked up on January 7th, 1973. What do we know about Cindy Schall?
Yeah, so Cynthia Shaw was a California native from Marin County in San Francisco, that area. She was raised by her mother, didn't know her father, I believe, for the first 15 years of her life. She had a brother, she had a sister. Her mom, by her accounts and the accounts I did interview, her brother was a great guy. Her mother was pretty abusive. He told me that she couldn't stand men. And so I think she had him locked up in juvenile hall or something like that. But Cindy Shaw ended up being sort of a caretaker in the family in some ways. She was a big babysitter, babysat her niece a lot. I think when she moved to Santa Cruz, she went to Cabrillo College, and she was actually living with a man who had a kid, and I don't know if she was the au pair exactly, but she took care of the kids in the house. Just that type of person, kind of a motherly person. But again, like all of us, there were different parts of her personality. So when her boss, who she was living with, was interviewed, oh, she's so great and caretaker and wonderful and perfect. You interview her friends, oh, she was doing a lot of drugs, a lot of LSD. She had a couple of bad trips. Oh, she hitchhiked everywhere. And then the boss, and it's like, no, she didn't hitchhike. What are you talking about? So another, obviously young. She was a Cabrillo student, but she was over on Mission Street in Santa Cruz, a rainy day, and she was picked up by Ed Kemper. Cindy Shaw did get in touch with her dad shortly before she died, so they were sort of having to come together, and somebody shared with me some letters that between her and her dad. So before she died, she had been back in touch with her father. There's one thing that he had talked about. That Cindy Shaw had talked about in a letter to her dad about how abusive her mother was, and there's a story, and it's in the book, about her mother saying, you ate this cake or something. You had eaten a piece of cake and you weren't supposed to, and she said, I hadn't done it, and the mother said, I'm gonna whip you with this belt 100 times. And she said she made it to 53 or 52 or something like that, and then she lied to her mother and said, okay, I ate it. And then she kind of, the wording was strange to where it was like, how she is. Like, I guess she was a very abusive person. And she said her little sister was at the door crying and the brother was laughing or something. It just didn't sound like a very healthy home.
It's heartbreaking.
That
she's writing this in a letter to her dad.
Who left. Yeah.
I mean, it's just, it's unsettling for sure.
What's weird is for me with Cindy Shaw is how many people I came across that knew her firsthand.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so I interviewed law enforcement, and there were one or two law enforcement folks that used her as a babysitter.
That's right.
And then, that was sort of strange. Yeah.
So once Ed Kemper picked her up, what transpired after that?
So it was the same story where he's telling her, I'm depressed, and you're going to live, you're going to be fine. And I think at one point he almost let her go. She had said some kind of story about her parents or her college education, that he said she was the one that he almost let her go, but he didn't. And he brought her up to Pajaro, I believe it was, and another side road, and got her to get in the. He was very excited about that murder because he had gotten a new pistol. He had said, I wasn't just killing somebody because I got a new pistol. Of course, he and his mother had gotten in a fight, but he was excited to use the new pistol. So he said that he convinced her to get in the trunk, and that he was going to bring her to his house or something, and instead he just shot her in the trunk and killed her.
And took the girl's corpse back over here to his mother's house to do unspeakable things. And once he was done, Ed detached Cindy's head and buried it outside here in his mother's garden. Just back there, behind the truck. Now, we can't go in there right now because there are people living here and we don't want to intrude, but yeah, the infamous mother's bedroom window. It's right behind there. Hi.
We have established beyond any reasonable and questionable doubt that the remains found are the remains of the missing person in our community.
This is Cynthia Ann Shaw.
Correct. She is a night student at the Cabrillo College here in the county. She is a live-in babysitter here in the city of Santa Cruz. Her parents live in the San Rafael area, Bay Area.
The residents of this area understandably are edgy. They're asking themselves, what kind of a mentality does it take to commit this kind of a grim murder? And is the killer still around these parts? It was just 6 months ago that a human head was found in the hills not too far from here, and the details of that murder still are a mystery.
So on February 5th, 1973, Ed Kemper and his mother had another humongous drop down, drag out, blow up fight with one another. And this angered Ed so much, he didn't know what to do with all these pent-up feelings he was having of rage and anger. And to say the least, somebody had to pay. So he drove his car all the way across town over here to the other side of town from Aptos. We're now up at UCSC, up here at the college, and we're right by the McHenry Library. And he drove up here. He could get on campus because his mother, remember Clarnell, she worked here at UCSC, and she got Ed a bumper sticker, like this sticker to put on his car that would allow him, it was a permit basically, that would allow him to be able to get access driving here onto campus. And that right there was a huge mistake. And he came up here to McHenry Library, and out in the parking lot, he met two girls. One was named Rosalind Thorpe, and the other one, her name was Alice Liu. And he asked both very calmly, very casually, if they needed a ride, because, you know, we're pretty far off the main drag here. So they were trying to get down off the hill here, off the higher part, of the upper part of campus, get down to the bottom. And they figured, you know, he's got a sticker on his car. He must either be a student or faculty member. How bad could it be? What harm could he be? So after picking up Rosalind and Alice, two innocent, completely innocent college co-ed girls, Ed drove them down this road here towards the base of the campus, towards the bottom. And right here, right up in here where you can see off in the distance, that is the Pacific Ocean out there. That is Santa Cruz. And it was right in here. I'm gonna pull over to give you a better look. It was right here in this stretch of road that Ed Kemper stopped the car and shot Rosalind Thorpe. And Alice Liu in the back still hadn't realized what all was going on and the magnitude of the danger that she was in. This is the actual site of where Kemper pulled over and executed both of those innocent college co-eds right here. And even though it is hazy, you have the beautiful Pacific Ocean out there in the distance. It is hazy, as I mentioned, as you can see here, but this is where Ed Kemper executed two of the college co-eds here at University of California, Santa Cruz campus. And Ed continued down this road, now with his brain completely on fire and his sexual appetite just can't wait to get out of here and get to a secluded place with the bodies of the two girls, with just madness on his mind. But he knew he also had to dodge one more bullet, literally, and that would be the gates down here at the bottom of the campus that you actually have to go through in order to get on the campus here. And as I mentioned, Ed was freely able to do so because his mother had given him that UCSC parking pass, or pass that allowed him up here on campus. He didn't have anything to worry about. So after these big fights with Clarnell, Ed would drive across town over here from Aptos and basically just go scouting for fresh meat, for new victims to take out his rage and his anger and his sexual perversions out on. So as you can tell, the gate was right here. off to your left. And this is where Ed had to get through. Apparently he was stopped by the guard and asked to pull over and show his ID, or at least get his bumper sticker checked, which he did. And from there, Ed Kemper proceeded to drive off campus here up into the woods. But that's the UCSC campus, and sadly the location of where Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu took their last breaths. Later that night, here on the street, with his mother just inside the house watching TV, Ed used a steel hunting knife that he called the General to decapitate both the heads off of his victims. And it's rumored that for the next few weeks, Kemper drove around with those heads wrapped up in plastic, and he kept out in the trunk that he parked right here on the street. Disgusting. So after the Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu murders, several months go by, and what happens next?
He had bought a pistol, and he got the paperwork for the pistol. Well, it came across to the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office that this person, who was not supposed to have a pistol, had bought a pistol. But strangely enough, all the records were sealed, so they didn't have access to it. So Mickey Alufi and another officer went out to get the pistol, and that's when Ed Kemper met Mickey Alufi, who he later, they had some kind of a relationship anyway. And Kemper got very paranoid when law enforcement took that pistol away, and he thought they were playing a cat and mouse game with him, and that they were onto him and onto his crimes, and it was all coming to a head. And he knew what he had to do, and that was kill his mom. Like, that was the big problem in his life. He knew that it was going to happen. He knew that it was time. And
I'm saying I'd wanted to kill my mother since I was 8 years old, and I'm not proud of that. It started with surrogates at a non-human level. Physical objects, my possessions, other people's, destruction of things that are cared about, and then destruction of things that are living on a lower level, small animals, insects, animals, and then finally people.
And it was on the night of April 20th, 1973, when his mother, Clarnell, returned home from a party, that Ed attempted to have a little conversation with her. But he was again met with rejection, and Clarnell basically told him to buzz off and dismissed him, saying she didn't want to, quote, sit up all night and talk. And with that sneering comment, that was the last straw. Now that same night, once he was sure Clarnell was sleeping, Ed entered his mother's room with a claw hammer in his hand. The serial killer later claimed that it hurt him to strike his mother's head with a hammer, again and again and again. But the treatment of his mother's body suggests otherwise. After slitting his mom's throat with a knife, Ed beheaded Clarnell's head and placed it on a mantelpiece. And for the next hour or so, he claimed to have screamed at the lifeless head, letting out every horrible thing that he ever wanted to tell his mother, but never had the courage to do whenever she was alive. The deranged Kemper then proceeded to use his mother's head as a dartboard, before cutting out Clarnell's tongue and larynx and throwing them in the garbage disposal to see if they would grind up, just for kicks. Now, one would think after such a spectacle, Ed would have stopped the madness right there. His mother was finally dead, and she could no longer harm him or ridicule him or get at him in any way. But instead, reality set in for Kemper, and he came to the realization that there was no way that he could get away from his mother's murder. He now needed to act fast and get himself a cover story to buy himself, some extra time. So he hatched a plan right then and there and invited over Clarnell's best friend, a lady named Sally Hallett. He invited her to this house here under the pretense of treating her and Clarnell to a dinner and a movie because Ed just got a promotion at work. And upon arriving here at the Kemper household, well, Sally met her own fate as she was strangled right inside that door right there, 609A. Ed believed that if the police came around, asking questions and whatnot, he could simply say that his mother was away on vacation with her, good old pal Sally. And after humiliating both corpses, frantic Ed Kemper knew that there was no way out. So he loaded up Sally's car with an arsenal of guns and ammunition and proceeded to flee the state of California. Now, Kemper made it all the way out to a place called Pueblo, Colorado, about 1,000 miles here from Aptos. Now on the lam, the 24-year-old was convinced the police were already hot on his trail. But strangely enough, Ed wasn't hearing reports of the two murder victims, and that only increased his anxiety, causing it to go haywire. Kemper didn't know what to do. He could keep on running, but he had nowhere to go. And for that moment right there, his urge to kill was gone. Now realizing that it was a pure waste of time to remain a fugitive, Ed Kemper found a payphone, the first one he could find. Now the last time he was in the same situation after executing his grandparents, the first person he called was Clarnell, but now that was no longer possible. So instead, Kemper called the Santa Cruz Police Department, hoping to get a hold of his old drinking buddy from the jury room. Well, instead, the cop who took Kemper's confession, who took his call, Kemper started to confess over the phone right there, and he just thought, that's old Big Ed just making a crank call, some sort of a sick joke. There was no way in hell the lovable oaf, the friendly nuisance from the jury room, could actually be a serial killer that they were actively searching for. So the cop wrote Kemper off and basically told him to call back later when one of the, his partners came into work so they could deal with Ed's nonsense. But then, believe it or not, the officer hung up on the killer right there, and he had just made a full-blown confession right over the phone, copying to 2 murders, let alone more. Short on funds, Kemper did call back later that day, but this time he called collect. He spoke to a new officer who described the intricate details about the murders of these young college students, these co-ed killing victims. Now with the cards out on the table, the cops had to accept this as truth, and they rushed to Colorado to arrest Big Ed.
This is a day of waiting in Santa Cruz. Residents are watching carefully as sheriff's investigators and District Attorney Peter Chang begin to build a case against Edward Kemper III. Chang's office is in this building, but today he's in Colorado talking to Kemper, the man who was supposed to have told Pueblo police that he had killed his mother and another woman in a duplex in the Santa Cruz community of Aptos Sea Cliff. Apparently, Kemper also told Pueblo police that he had previously killed 6 college girls in the Santa Cruz area.
So here we are back in downtown Santa Cruz, and this is just a quick stop, but this is actually the auto body shop the former auto body shop of where they took Kemper's car to. And you can see these windows up in there, or right in the background of the pictures of when after the police arrested him and brought his car into the impound to be taken apart. And that's where they found his murder mobile. Creepy. Just creepy. It's right about right here where they took it apart. Anyways, this is it. This is the building. But I gotta act fast because the Santa Cruz Police Department is directly right across the street, and I see some guys coming out of the office here, so. We'll get going here. Now, after his very, very explicit confession, Edmund Emil Kemper III was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder back in May of 1973. But despite admitting to the brutal killings, Ed case still went to trial right down at the main courthouse in downtown Santa Cruz, with his lawyer, Jim Jackson, arguing that Kemper was not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, obviously, no one could deny that the actions that Ed took upon his victims sounded like those of a completely mentally insane person. But still, the court rejected his plea for insanity. To be found criminally insane, a person needs to be unable to understand the difference between right and wrong. And Ed Kemper most definitely knew he wasn't supposed to go around killing people and taking their heads off. In fact, Kemper understood that the terrifying nature of his crime so well that he asked to be tortured to death after being found guilty on all accounts on November 8, 1973. But much to the chagrin of the surrounding community here in Santa Cruz, Ed's wishes to be tortured could not be granted by a court of law, of course. And in addition to this, he also couldn't get the electric chair or a lethal hotshot at the time either, all due to a moratorium placed on capital punishment by the Supreme Court of California. Instead, Ed Kemper received 8 concurrent life sentences. Now, at the end of the day, serial killer Ed Kemper took a total of 10 innocent people out of this world. When asked about the reasoning for his atrocious crimes, Kemper responded to the question coolly as stated, quote, It was my little social experiment. I was trying to hurt society where it hurt the worst, and that was by taking away its valuable future members of the working society. He also followed that up by stating, I was striking out at what was hurting me the worst, which was the area here in Santa Cruz. I guess deep down, I wanted to fit in the most, but I never fit in. End quote. Now, to this very day in 2025, Ed Kemper remains inside the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he's considered to be a model convict. For many years, he worked inside the prison library, narrating audiobooks for the visually impaired. Believe it or not, a Los Angeles Times article once confirmed that Ed Kemper had personally spent over 5,000 hours narrating books with several hundred complete recordings to his name. Also, while incarcerated, Kemper willingly helped law enforcement, including the FBI, to understand how serial killers operate. Famed FBI profiler John Douglas even admitted that he liked Ed, describing the co-ed killer as a friendly, open, and sensitive kind of guy with a sense of humor. But despite his good qualities, what Ed Kemper did to his victims is enough to keep him behind bars for the rest of his life, or at least until his next parole board hearing. The now 76-year-old serial killer stated, quote, I think I could handle parole, but I believe wholeheartedly that society is not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that.
I hate to distill it down into such, into one-word realities like that. There's a lot that leads into that happening, but that is what happened. They represented not what my mother was, but what she liked, what she coveted, what was important to her, and I was destroying it.
Why did you actually kill the girls?
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships. I knew absolutely nothing about that whole area, even if just sitting down and talking with a young lady.
My first date was an absolute disaster. It wasn't her fault, you know, and I didn't blame her even then. I'm saying it was a terrible tragedy, but boy, she didn't ever talk to me again. It was awful. It wasn't sexual or grabbing at her or nothing. I was just such a dork, taking her to a John Wayne movie and Denny's. It's terrible. I'd never been on a date. At 16, that was cool, you know. I'd never been on a date, you know. I was locked up since I was 15. But I can't tell her that. Oh, gee, you don't mind me. You know, she kind of got hung up on my looks or whatever. You know, I mean, she's a gorgeous young lady.
Why do you feel that so many people still remain fascinated with the Ed Kemper story decades later?
Honestly, I think it's a snappy, easy story. I think Ed Kemper's big. I think he's relatively good looking. Crimes are so lurid, you know, and sexual in nature. I think if you want to just jump into the worst of the worst, he's there, you know. And I think that he speaks very well for himself. He was interviewed many times, changed his story accordingly as he needed to keep it interesting. I think also because he was one of the first that really talked about his crimes in an open way, that is very interesting. I think that the whole Mindhunter thing, when they were, the FBI started that whole division to look into crimes, the behavioral, I can't remember the exact name of their department, but he was the first one that they came out and interviewed because he would talk so openly about his crimes. It sort of lines itself up, you know. You don't need, he's doing it himself. You don't need experts or whatever, magazines or other people to uncover anything because it's all right there. There's no expose of like, who was this guy? Everyone knows who he was and what he did because he speaks for himself. Go watch a YouTube video. There's 1,000 out there. Go watch, you know. There was crime magazines at the time. He's all over them. So, and then he handled his own publicity quite well. He talked to the local reporters. He talked to Marge Von B. He talked to them and gave them insight and stories and things. So, and his quotes are snappy and clever, and he does his own. And when you hear him speak, he comes across coherent and relatively normal, but then the words that are coming out of his mouth are anything but normal.
Where can people go to get a copy of Murder Capital of the World?
I would recommend you go to Bookshop Santa Cruz. They have a website. But it is available online anywhere. I had a website, murdercapitaloftheworld.com. I don't really keep it updated, but there's some information there. The book isn't fun, it isn't happy, it isn't nice, but it is interesting. It's our local history.